question, just to connect it to the kind of work that our scholars do. And this is exactly what I do every time we have talks. Because listening to you, I could see that the Indian Railway still has kind of fascinating impact over the general mindset. I'm sure you must be aware about the politics going on in terms of naming trains with glowing connotations of Vande Bharat and this train and that has a big impact politically and socially on the Indian mindset. So while I understand that your project of looking into the political economy of Indian Railway and their so-called, as you mentioned, the so-called civilizing mission and the ecological cost involved in terms of setting up the Indian Railway, all fair enough, and I admit. But interesting on the other side as well. I mean, scholars working on, say, print capitalism, on modernity, colonial modernity, but the connectivity to the Indian Railway executed through the networks across the country. That is also quite interesting because this is how they could execute that connecting link across the length and breadth of India. Otherwise, it would not have been perhaps possible. So I think this is also interesting when we talk about the Indian railways because we have this side of India as well. Cultural connectivity, then in terms of spreading of information, circulation of newspapers and other commodities, business and commerce. I was interested to know whether, when you mentioned that some of the contractors and the officials talked about the local resistance to the railway and the proliferation of the railway tracks through the lands, did you come across any archival records which mentioned that some of them did flag these issues, that we should not go ahead with it? But they were a large, comprehensive kind of endorsement within the colonial machinery that we should push ahead with the railways plan. Or were there some alternative voices within the colonial machinery? Did you come across any archival sources like that? And another thing is that since you mentioned about that archive, if I'm not mistaken, that was discovered in Vaxu itself, those box. I remember Kunal mentioned about it, that there was the house and that contained that box. So he was from Sweden, that gentleman was from Sweden, right? So I mean, was there a kind of transnational network of these contractors and circulation of workers? Because he came from Sweden to India to act as a railway contractor. Am I correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So what about the analogies between the Nordic experience of railway tracks and the kind of experience that you studied here? I mean, do you find some similarities there also? They encountered similar problems? Because I remember that when we talk about railways in America, there are two sorts of responses. One is the one that you mentioned, and quite justifiably so. But at the same time, I could see that most of the scholars are literature students. Whitman and others celebrated the railways in terms of the locomotives, the coming of the steam engine, the Hollywood films projecting the arrival of the steam engine. Even in Bengal, Satyajit Ray would project the Opu trilogy, where you see the famous scene of the railway steam engine coming. Yes. So, of course, it has been projected as an intrusion of that colonial modernist project within the indigenous cultural sphere. Gandhi was very much opposed to it, but Gandhi at the same time traveled throughout India with the railways. So Gandhian politics could succeed because of the railways, but at the same time Gandhi was against the railways. So I could see the inherent contradictions there, but that apart, it would be interesting to know whether you could come across any archival material that shows that some of the colonial officials also flagged the issue that we should not move ahead with that, because that would jeopardize the cultural and the ecological concerns there. And the other one is that how do you bless the Nordic experience?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you also for flagging this idea of connecting it more maybe to the national, idea. I think that's been done as a Prasad's book.
Right.
Where she really talks about, how it changes also the social idea of time and space and mobilities, right? I think that's a great source to bring in also for me. I mentioned briefly, I think, about the Joseph Stevens as a contractor coming. He was Anglo-Scandinavian, right? So born to British parents in Stockholm, and then as a teenager he moved to Copenhagen with his family, then 2 siblings and parents. So his father became a professor of English. I'm not sure to say English literature because he was really not trained in literature, but he was a phrenologist, but he was native English speaker, right? So that was, I think, connected to his appointment. I mean, the link to his appointment there is in English. Joseph's older sister got married to a British railway engineer. Abbott was his surname, I forgot his first name now, who then built the railways from Roskilde, a town in southern Denmark, to Copenhagen. So he was part of that band of engineers who had been properly trained in northern England as an engineer. And Joseph was then, when Abbott and this team of engineers moved on from Denmark to India, to Bombay, to build the railways there in 1856 or 55, because they experienced the Indian uprising in 1857. Yeah, that's the point. And which they also then describe, and then they come back to Copenhagen, and then Joseph is recruited as an apprentice of Abbott, right? So he joins him as an apprentice to start with, to become a civil engineer. He has this long contract written where it says that he would be trained as a civil engineer and fed meat as a part of his salary, and so forth, right? Everything included. So that is like a good deal for him, and his sister writes his younger sister writes to him in India saying that everyone wants to send their son to India. It's like a golden opportunity at this point, 59, 60, when you also have this great boom then of the construction. So what I can see is that Abbott knew that Joseph was going to be able to make a lot of money, and the family did not have money. So that was like a purpose of this. So the circulation of these engineers and contractors, yes, there's certainly a network there in place. I think what is interesting is, of course, also that the other engineers then later on goes down to build the railways in Palestine, for example. So there are these like same engineers that move around, or their apprentices that move around different spots across the world. So that is definitely there. What we can see that Joseph did, because the railways was not as laid out as it was in India and in Sweden when he came back in 1869. So he starts immediately when he comes back, when he has bought his estate, this is where the box with documents was found. He immediately starts to see how can I export timber from this region, right? So he buys a big iron estate that is kind of run down, but he sees the natural resources that come with it, this big forest, right? It's a landed estate, just what his father wanted him to buy for the money, a landed estate, because they were non-landed, right? And so he starts immediately to develop this idea of a railway line. And this is also very similar to what happened in the UK and other places, the debate between canals and railways, right? It was the same in India. Should they develop the canals instead of the railways, and they decide for the railways instead. And in Sweden, canals has always been in favor in the north because there is a lot of water, a lot of forest, mainly in the northern parts. And it's a very long country, right? But the northern parts are full of forest up to a certain northern degree, right? So the canals have been used extensively for taking timber to the coast, and from there on continue the shipping, right? But in southern Sweden, there's also this networks of canals. So the railway then ties together, the railway that is developed also ties together canal networks and railway heads and ports. So you have the Baltic Sea, and then the port in Malmö towards Copenhagen, and from there on onwards to either to northern England, Liverpool, or to London. So there, he is more than geared towards exporting towards London, of course, because that's where he has his contacts after 1869. But what Joseph also doesn't know, as it appears, which is kind of peculiar in a way, is the additional costs of exporting to the empire, right? So there are different fees and charges and tolls that are not really profitable. So I would say to begin with, when he comes back to Sweden, when he returns, he tries to export to the empire, but gradually it would be more local export and local also industrialization. And this is also very peculiar, a big difference to the UK, because Sweden's industrialization was much later than the UK's, right? So you have this industrialization that actually coincides with the 1870s when Joseph arrives. So he arrives in Sweden when there's a boom of industrialization after the big recession of the 1860s, and especially 66, 67 when he buys the estate. So they're quite interesting, you know, what should I say, analogs to the cotton boom in terms of like he can suddenly use the resources, the natural resources, for exporting to other local industries in Sweden and in Denmark. There are lots of Danish farmers, big farmers, who buy up land in Sweden at this point and start making wood pulp. Again, then for house construction.
Sorry to interrupt. When
Yeah.
you talk about Nordic colonialism,
Mm.
I mean, does it include this the study on railways in the Nordic countries?
Yeah, I mentioned this article also in the introduction there, in the north on settler colonialism and different forms of belonging that are constructed through infrastructure. We also have another professor from the Technological University who works on these large-scale infrastructures, including the mines in the north. And this is quite interesting also, just like in India, a very current topic, like mines in tribal lands, which is a continuation of late 19th century practice, right? So we have this huge mine, the largest one in Northern Europe is in North Sweden, Kiruna mine, LKAB, and it's currently being transferable communities because of these, the danger of these mines caving in the end, right? So there is similar studies. I mean, there are lots of interesting ways of how land use and infrastructure has changed with the coming of infrastructure. With how land use and communities have changed with the coming of infrastructure. But of course, also this, I shouldn't say the same as empire, but different nation states have claimed different territories from the Sami population that live in the northern parts, right? So there is definitely a strand in Nordic colonial studies that look at how infrastructure has impacted and how tribal lands in these areas have changed with so-called, of course, so-called colonialism, because I wouldn't say it is officially recognized as colonialism in our case with the nation states. Then we would have to do something more constructive about the situation we have today. But there is, of course, a concurrent debate about this, very much so today. Sorry, I completely forgot your first question. I got so much into this, but so just remind me what it was.
The first question was on the kind of this contradictions and related to the archives that you engaged with, and whether you connect.
Yes, sorry, no, I remember. Yeah, definitely there are some hesitations, but I wouldn't say it is related to the ecological impact of it. But as I mentioned also in this introductory slide, there is continuously from the 1840s or 1850s a remark about access to water in this land. That it's basically impossible for them to cross the land with cavalry for the horses because there's not enough grass and there's not enough water. So this is like very complicated to so to say govern from the perspective of the sources. So how to govern the land becomes a question, but not how to stop it. They're pointing out the difficulties, and I don't think that the railways necessarily is considered being more problematic than any other mode of transport or infrastructure in the area. But water is it is always, of course, a crucial matter for infrastructural building, absolutely, but it is pointed out as a major shortage in various points. And of course, also for cotton cultivation, you need water and a certain soil base, right? So this is carefully mapped where it is. But in terms of like accessing the land, water is one issue. The other one would be, of course, the issue of labor. I would say would be the biggest shortage, like not having enough labor to progress with the constructions. That would be the major, I would say that they are saying the hindrance of progression of the railways rather than anything that is pointed out, right? But I'm sure I would find even more on water when I continue with these sources that I gathered. I would be surprised if I didn't, so to say, right? Because it is really a recurring feature.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.